If you have the PSAT this week, this video might literally save you. That's because in this video, I'm going to be covering 7 of the most important strategies and rules you need to understand if you want a chance of doing well this week on the PSAT. And the best part is that these are plug and play PSAT rules. Even if you don't have time to do a bunch of practice problems, if you just understand the stuff I'm going to show in this video, your score will still improve simply because you'll be able to approach these problems better when you see it on the PSAT. And also, all this stuff works with regular SAT too, so if you're planning to take that, this video will still help. Let's get straight into it. The first thing you need to master if you want to do well in the PSAT is grammar. There are 2 real main parts of this. First is independent clause and dependent clause stuff. Let's cover what an independent clause is. In a general sense, an independent clause is something that can exist all on its own in a sentence. But that part doesn't really mean that much to you, so let me explain what it has to have. First, it has to have a subject. A subject is a thing that does the action. For example, if I say the sentence, John went to the store, the subject is John. Next, it needs a main verb. Just to cover what a verb is first, it's something that shows an action being done. Like if you say the doctor walks to the store, walks is the verb. If you say the student goes to school, goes is the verb. A main verb essentially just means it doesn't violate one of the 3 rules I'm going to show you right now. In order to be a main verb, the verb cannot end in ing, start with to, or start with that. Just to be clear, these are examples of things that cannot be main verbs. If it doesn't have this, most of the time it'll be a main verb. Sometimes it still won't, but you'll kind of be able to tell with what I'm about to show you. The final thing that an independent clause must have is no weird beginning. You'll get what this means in a second. So let's say you have 2 independent clauses. How do you separate them? There are essentially 3 different ways. The first is with a semicolon. Specifically a semicolon. This is not a comma, this is not a period, a semicolon. Then with a comma followed by a fanboy. Fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So if you have a comma followed by any of these, that can separate 2 independent clauses. And the final way is with just a period. But what if you have an independent clause and a dependent clause? As you can probably get at this point, a dependent clause is something that cannot exist on its own. So basically it's something that violates one of these 3 rules shown above here. The only way you can really separate these is either with just a comma or with literally no punctuation. Here's 2 independent clauses. Skibbity toilet videos are the best, and I watch them 6-7 times per day. The first independent clause is skibbity toilet videos are the best. You can notice here it has skibbity toilet, which is the subject, are, which is the verb, and the best, and it doesn't begin with any kind of weird phrase at the beginning. The second thing, I watch them 67 times per day. That is also an independent clause because you see I, which is the subject, watch, which is the verb, and then 67 times per day. Keep in mind that if you have and at the beginning of it, this kind of destroys the independentness of the clauses. So I'm kind of counting this without the word and included. This you can say is an example of an independent clause and a dependent clause. The independent clause is skibbity toilet videos are the best. The dependent clause is though they are cringe. This is a dependent clause because it begins with though. Though is one of those words that typically indicates a weird beginning. Other examples of this are among, while. You kind of can notice them when they appear. And whenever you see something like, if you said the phrase though they are cringe, you would expect some kind of other thing being needed to finish off that sentence. That doesn't really sound like a full sentence on its own. So for that reason, it's a dependent clause. So let's see if we can figure out this example. John's 14-day SAT rescue plan is the blank. Some of the people who have used it have literally seen 100+ score improvements in only 2 weeks. John's 14-day SAT rescue plan is the whatever. It has to be best as shown by the choices here. So we know that this is basically going to be an independent clause because John's 14-day SAT rescue plan is the best. That's a fully independent clause. Some of the people who have used it have literally seen 100+ score improvements in only 2 weeks. That also works on its own because you see some of the people is essentially the subject and you see have literally seen, which is the verb, 100+ score improvements in only 2 weeks. It doesn't start with while or even or among. So for that reason, this would also be a fully independent clause. Which one of these choices can be used to separate 2 independent clauses? Well, this one only has a comma, so that definitely won't work. This has a semicolon, so that does work. This has nothing, so that doesn't work. And this has and, but it doesn't have a comma before it. For that reason, it does not work. If you only have and, that's not enough to separate 2 independent clauses. And by the way, link in description. Let's talk briefly about lists. This is another very common thing on the SAT. If you're trying to separate 3 different topics, you need a comma after the first one, a comma after the second one, and to finish off the thing. For example, watching Subway Surfers footage for 5 hours per day is fun, exciting, and healthy. Notice we have a comma here, a comma there, and no comma after and. Moving on to colons real quick. These are less common, but you can sometimes see them on the SAT. What these basically mean is expanding on a thought that was originally said at the previous point in the sentence. An example of this, the committee agreed on one blank, expanding weekend bus service for students. The correct choice here would be the one with a colon because they're saying the priority is expanding weekend bus service for students. That's a description of what the priority is. It expands on what's said before. And what about a dash here? When you have a dash, you need 2 of them in the sentence, and it splits off unnecessary information essentially. Skibbity Riz is, no joke, one of the best things to happen to Western civilization since the creation of the light bulb. Bruh. The no joke part is just an extra thing they're trying to throw into the sentence, and so for that reason you need these two dashes to separate it from the other stuff. That's enough of that, so let's move on to verbs. A lot of SAT grammar questions involve verbs. So let's talk about what this means. There are basically three different classifications you can use to determine what verb it is. First is singular versus plural. In case you don't know, if you only have one of something, it's singular. But if you have two or more of something, it's plural. If you have one friend, that's singular. If you have multiple friends, that's plural. And verbs have to be matched with their singular or plural counterparts. So you can see here an example of is, was, and has. Are, were, and have are the plural versions of these verbs. And so if you see a question like this, you have to match up the singular or plural versions with whatever one you have then. Then main verbs. If you remember the classifications we used before, this also applies for questions like these. So keep in mind, some verbs are main verbs, some are not main verbs. And finally, verb tense. I won't go through all of this right now, but I have this table over here that shows you basically all the different tenses you can see on the SAT. I have this in the link in the description in my SAT school community, so definitely check this out if you want to see it and download it and look at it for as long as you want. But the key things you want to know for this is some verbs are present tense, some are past tense, and some are future tense. That means exactly what it sounds like. If it's present tense, it's happening right now. If it's past tense, it's happening sometime in the past. And if it's future tense, it's happening sometime in the future. You'll be able to clearly see this when you see a sentence, so it'll make a lot more sense. The future stuff usually has the will involved, the past stuff usually has ed involved, and then the present stuff usually has s involved at the end of the word, though not always, as you can see in some of these examples. The key thing about these SAT verb questions is while you can spend a bunch of time focusing on them, if you just choose the odd one out, oftentimes that's enough to go for the right answer. Let's provide an example. During the TikTok Riz party of 2024, many observers blank unusual changes in people's behavior. You have these 4 different examples, but if you remember from before, 3 of these are not main verbs and only one of them is a main verb. This ends in ing, so that's a not main verb. This has to at the beginning, so that's not a main verb. This is a main verb. And then that has that at the beginning, so that is not a main verb. This is the only one that actually is a main verb, so that is the correct answer. And if you look at it, it also makes sense. Observers observed unusual changes. That makes sense. A bouquet of roses straight from the heart of Ohio, blank on the table. If you notice, this is plural, this is plural, this is plural, and this is singular. For that reason, B is the answer. A bouquet of roses. And it is singular because bouquet is singular. And when you're saying something of something, the first thing, that's the plurality that you look at. Scientists predict the comet blank visible next summer. This goes to tense. So this is harder to use the odd one out thing because each of these could theoretically work. None of them has like a comma thing between them. But if you think about it, next summer, that indicates it's going to be happening in the future. So you have to go with will because that's the only future verb here. Let's move on to the next thing. But before I do, let me show you this pyramid. This shows you what I believe to be the best way to approach SAT studying. It is grouped from the easiest stuff to learn to the hardest stuff to learn. So if you don't have a lot of time to prepare for the SAT, I'd recommend focusing on only the bottom 3 or maybe the bottom 4 stuff on this pyramid. The top 3 stuff is good to focus on too, and if you have extra time, and if you have plenty of time, definitely focus on it. But the bottom 4 stuff is definitely the easiest to learn in the shortest amount of time. And that stuff is also stuff we're going to be mainly focusing on in this video. If you're wondering why I know this, it's just because I've seen so many students and I've seen so many SAT practice problems, and this is consistently what ends up being the easiest and hardest material. Student notes. With many SAT questions, you'll be given a set of notes, and then you're going to be asked to find some phrase that best supports some part of the notes. The key thing for a question like this is you don't want to actually read the notes. This is basically the only time in the SAT you don't want to really be reading everything, and you should enjoy it while it lasts because the other stuff is going to be really important you read everything. Instead, you should just read the question. The student wants to emphasize a difference in the origins of the 2 slang terms. Which choice most effectively uses relevant information to accomplish this goal? So you may be thinking, how am I supposed to figure this out if I didn't read the original stuff? Well, you can just notice which ones actually show a difference. Look at this. Riz has a pre-internet root, whereas yacht sprang from streamer chat as a brand new coinage with no dictionary ancestor. That sounds like a difference, so that probably is going to be the answer. In 2023, Riz and yacht went giga-viral on TikTok, proving slang evolves faster than my attention span. This shows a similarity between the two because they both went giga-viral, so that would not be the correct answer. Riz was pushed by Kai Cenat, while yacht caught on through your rage. Nevertheless, both creators farmed W clout. While it does show a difference, the second part of it shows a similarity. And so since we're trying to emphasize the biggest difference, since they show a similarity, that would basically make it so it's not as big of a difference. You're basically trying to emphasize what the question is asking for. And so if this doesn't emphasize it well enough, it's not going to be the right answer. The rise of Riz and Gyat show Gen Z is cooking. Both words should be added to every dictionary for real. Again, it's the similarity, not difference, so that's out. A is the correct answer. Try this one for yourself. When dissolved oxygen drops, there's a decline of fish survival. Lakes can develop algal blooms after nutrient runoff increases. Nutrient runoff can cause algal blooms, and decomposition lowers dissolved oxygen. Fish dives in some lakes have occurred as a result of decreased dissolved oxygen caused by decomposition of algal blooms fueled by nutrient-rich runoff. Here's the thing, both B and C are definitely not it. They don't really accomplish the goal of the question at all. But A and D both could kind of work. The main difference is you're trying to find which one specifies the key reason and also discusses the fish die-offs. So here's the thing, D would be the correct answer because even though A works, it's not as specific, it's not as clear, and only D is the one that even mentions the die-offs in the first place. The key thing with these questions is you gotta be strict with what you eliminate. Stuff will definitely sound really good in these questions, but you gotta be sure you only go with the one that most clearly emphasizes what the question is asking you to find. 4 is transitions. You're gonna be given questions like this where you get 2 sentences or 2 phrases and you have to find the best transition for them. To best answer these questions, you want to start with reading over the passage. The school cafe dropped limited edition ghost pepper nuggies at lunch. The line wrapped 3 hallways. The milk fridges were empty in 10 minutes. Then you want to actually predict what you think the transition word will be. Don't look at the choices yet, just think what sounds like it would make the most sense for this. I think it would probably be something like as a result or consequently, because we're saying that since they had these nuggies and they were so hot, they had to use all the milk to calm their tongues. Consequently is the right answer, so you pick it and move on. Although many city parks focus on lawns and paved paths, recent designs integrate features that support pollinators. Riverside Green includes native milkweed meadows and bee hotels arranged along a walking loop. So basically they're providing an example of something that is discussed in the previous part of the sentence. So I would get something like, for example. Believe it or not, that's one of the choices, so I can just go with that. The key thing is you've got to be focusing on the details of these questions. There's going to be many times where multiple choices will seem correct, but only one really aligns with the details. For example, if I didn't think about how the milk fridges were necessary to calm their tongues, any of these choices really could have worked, because any of them could have a different relationship, depending on what you think milk fridges are doing. As a result, you need to really understand every single word of these questions. Even though they may be a little bit hard, if you can do that, these questions will be extremely easy on the test. Also, you gotta be pretty familiar with the transition words themselves. I have a Quizlet link in the description of this video that shows a bunch of the key transition words you need to know on the SAT, so check that out if you're still struggling on this right now. Passage questions. These are a little bit higher in the pyramid than the other ones, but they're still pretty good to understand. When you see a question like this, try to stay calm. Then do this. First, read over what the question is asking. Which choice completes the text with the most logical inference? So we're trying to find what will basically fill in the blank for this question. Then you want to actually read over the passage. Internet skivvy lore comes from a pile of sources. Early clips like OG Cappy Walk and the 2022 meme Doomsday Goober. A major source from the 2023 Streamlogger Chronicles of Skivvy shaped most of the canon. Some of its bits were later remixed by the creator Zed into the 2024 webcomic Sigma Saga. But Zed didn't just remix, he added the Riz Council, a crew that meets in a perfectly round VR chamber, which suggests that, and then at this point you want to actually make your prediction as for what you think the answer is going to be. So I think the answer is going to be based around the fact that Zed, he didn't just take what was already existing, he actually added a brand new thing that completely changed how this webcomic existed before. The Riz Council must have completely changed how the Sigma Saga worked in the first place, because who knows what the Riz Council is doing for all these different people and managing their Riz. So now look at the answers. The key thing for being able to decipher between these answer choices is making sure you don't rely on any kind of outside information or assumptions. A bunch of these choices are going to look correct, but only one of them is going to be fully based on what is said in the passage itself, and only that one's going to be the answer. Sigma Saga is more trustworthy than the Chronicles of Skivvy because it corrects timeline errors. That could be 100% correct, but it sure as frick does not say it in the passage above, so you just cannot go over that answer. Earlier entries like OG Cappy Walk and Doomsday Goober are already centered on a Riz Council. That is definitely not said in the passage. They don't even mention the Riz Council until the very end, so that cannot be it. C. The idea of a council gathering in a round chamber is new to Sigma Saga and not found in the prior sources. Here's the thing, you could say that that's not fully said in the passage, but it just literally has to be true. Because if Zed added the Riz Council, it could not have been in any of the other stuff. It's like if you asked, could George Washington have known about the iPhone? He could not have, because it did not exist when George Washington was alive. And for that reason, this logically makes sense based off of what is said. We can just check D though. Zed was unaware of the old eclipse when he started Sigma Saga. It just isn't supported by anything said in the passage. We don't know he was aware of the old eclipse. He probably was, but who even knows? And so for that reason, that's just not clearly stated, so we can eliminate that one. C is the only one that logically makes sense based off of what is said. Even though this makes a slight inference, because it doesn't directly say it in the passage, It just literally would be impossible for the other people to have known about the risk council. To save time, I'm not going to go through this problem, but just take a second to actually look at it and see if you can figure out what the answer would be. Dragonflies hunt mosquitoes only when other and more nutritious insects are unavailable. We don't really talk about the other insects in this passage, so that can't be it. Dragonflies avoid feeding on both nutritionally poor and nutritionally rich mosquitoes and thus cannot thrive in cities. It does not say that, it says the exact opposite. They actually feed on both. Dragonflies consume fewer mosquitoes overall than other aerial predators do. Okay, already we know this is not going to be it because it doesn't even talk about any other aerial predators. Dragonflies do not always avoid nutritionally poor mosquitoes, so restoring dragonfly populations could still help reduce urban mosquito numbers. Yes, that makes sense, that's what's supported, and this would logically make sense because if you have more dragonflies, they're going to eat more mosquitoes, and so therefore there's going to be less mosquitoes. Desmos in basic math. Now we're going to be covering the math. Desmos is allowed on the SAT and the PSAT. So if you use this, it's going to absolutely change your ability to do these math questions. It's going to make it extremely easy. So if you don't have much time to study math before the PSAT, just straight up learn Desmos. It'll be the most valuable thing you can do before that PSAT. But before I show you that, let me just brush up on what a function is. You probably know this, but in case some of you don't, it's pretty good to understand. There are these things called variables. And for every x, there's one y. What this means is for whatever number you put into x, there's going to be a different y number generated as a result of it. In an example like this, for example, if you have y equals 2x plus 1, if x equals 1, then you have y equals 2 times 1 plus 1. That equals 2 plus 1, which equals 3. If x is equal to 2, then you have 5 as the answer. If x is equal to 3, then you have 7 as the answer. And you can just plug in any one you can think of into x. It creates a table like this. 1, 2, 3 for x equals 3, 5, 7 for y. But thankfully, you don't even need to really think about this because Desmos can do a lot of this work for you. Say you're asked to solve for x in a question like this. You can literally just type in what I just typed in, and you'll see that there are 2 answers because each line corresponds to one answer to the solution. So you have 3 and 4 as being the answers. If you want to know why there can be 2, you don't really need to worry about that. You just need to notice how many solutions there are and say that for your answer. But what if instead of just one equation, you're given 2 equations, like in this example here? You're trying to solve now for x and y. Let me show you what this means. If you type in both of the equations to Desmos, you get shown 2 lines that intersect like this. The answer to this problem is where the lines intersect. So that's -8, -9. -8 is the x value and -9 is the y value. That's how these systems of equations problems work. They will look very complicated, but with Desmos, they're extremely easy. Next, let's shift gears for a second. Find the median of this data set. Again, you actually don't really need to think about this because Desmos can do it for you. If you type in this, you'll see the median is 10. That's literally all you need to do. Maybe make sure that you type in everything correctly, but other than that, you're all good. This one is a little bit harder, but actually not too much. Find the linear equation that corresponds to these data points. What you want to do is make a table in Desmos and put in all these points. You do this by typing in the word table. Okay, so there are all my points. And then the next step of this process is you want to click this and then see linear. It could also be something else if the problem asks you for something else, but in this example, it's just a linear regression. And you can see now y equals 2x minus 1. That is the answer. This problem is even easier. It asks you to find the vertex of this function. You guessed it, you type in the function into Desmos and you see this. You may be confused for a second, but this is exactly what it is supposed to look like. For the vertex, it's just the bottom points on the function, which Desmos makes really easy to select. I did that just by clicking here and it just showed me. 4, -9, that's where the vertex is. Now there's a bunch of other stuff you could learn for SAT math, but I think the other most important thing you can focus on is right triangles. These are all over the SAT in the geometry section, and you really want to be knowing this if not for anything else on the test. There are 3 main things you can do with any right triangle. The first is the Pythagorean theorem. You see, if you draw some letters on this triangle, like A, B, and C, if you then set up this equation, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, you can solve for basically any of the sides. The only thing is you need to be given 2 of the sides in order to solve for the third one. So if you're given a problem like this, you can just do 2 squared plus 3 squared equals c squared. That's going to give you 13 equals c squared. And finally, what you can do is if you take the square root of both sides, you get c is equal to square root of 13. And yes, you actually could have used Desmos for all of these steps, so I did not even need to write any of that out, just keep that in mind. Next thing you can do with right triangles is SOHCAHTOA. This is only really possible if you're given one of the angle measurements along with the sides. So say you're being shown that this is equal to 20 degrees. What SOHCAHTOA means is sine of an angle is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse. Cosine of an angle is equal to the adjacent over the hypotenuse. and tangent of an angle is equal to opposite over adjacent. What this may look like is sine of 20 degrees is equal to the opposite, notice what's on the opposite side of the triangle, which is 3, over the hypotenuse, which is the longest side of the triangle, C. So if we're given this, we can then solve for what C would have to be. In case you're wondering, the opposite side is the opposite, the one on the side of it is adjacent, and the biggest side is the hypotenuse. That's how it always is going to work. And so with this, you could use cosine of 20, tangent of 20, whatever. You just have to make sure to match up what side you're given and what side you're trying to solve for. And again, you could put this in Desmos and solve for what C would have to be equal to by doing that. Third thing is 30, 60, 90. Basically, if you're given a right triangle and one angle is 30 degrees, one angle is a right angle, which is 90 degrees, and one angle is 60 degrees, you then know some things about how this triangle works. The side with the 30 degrees has to be x times square root of 3. The side with 60 degrees has to just be x, and the final side remaining has to be 2x. And that's just how this works. If you're wondering what x means, it can literally be any different number. But this really helps a lot if you're given one side and being told to solve for the other ones. For example, if you're being told that this side is just square root of 3, you know in this case x has to be equal to 1. So that would just be 1, and then this other side would just be 2. If you're given that this side is 3 times square root of 3, then you know that this side has to be 3, and this side has to be 3 times 2, which is 6. With these three tools, you can solve almost any right triangle problem you see on the SAT. If you still want some extra guidance, I have a 5-day plan in my school community that showcases exactly what you can do every single day if you only have 5 days to study for the PSAT and you need a good score. It's not going to give you literally everything you need, but if you want a really fast way to study and get the maximum chances of a high score, this might be it. Good luck on the PSAT this week.